What if I told you that America didn't take on the Vietnam War all by itself? Behind the dense jungles and the headlines, soldiers from countries like Australia, South Korea, Thailand, and others fought and lost their lives as well. This is the untold story of the free world forces who stood with the United States, not for fame, but in a conflict that many of their own people had little faith in. The Vietnam War is often seen as just an American conflict fought alongside South Vietnamese allies, with no outside help. In reality, over 40 nations lent a hand to the Republic of Vietnam in its battle against the Communists. 5 nations joined the U.S. in offering direct military support: South Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. 4 of these nations sent combat troops to fight by the side of American and South Vietnamese soldiers, while the Philippines contributed a civic action battalion that assisted South Vietnamese forces in Tay Ninh province. This paper aims to explore the events that led to the commitment of what came to be known as Free World Military Forces in Vietnam. To grasp why and how these nations became part of the Free World Military Forces in Vietnam, we must first understand how the United States got involved in Southeast Asia. The U.S. initially entered Vietnam by backing French forces against the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and their withdrawal from Indochina, the United States took up the challenge. The first U.S. advisory troops arrived in Vietnam in 1954, and the American presence steadily increased until 1965, when the first U.S. combat troops were deployed to South Vietnam. From the earliest days of American involvement in Southeast Asia, U.S. policymakers operated under certain assumptions about the conflict in Vietnam. Just as they viewed the Korean War as a battle against North Korean and Chinese communist aggression, they perceived the war in Vietnam as another chance to combat communist expansion. In Korea, the U.S. had rallied allies to join the fight against communism, bolstering their ranks and reinforcing the credibility of the American effort. It is not surprising that in the early 60s, as the U.S. began to define its commitment to Vietnam, discussions about multilateral aid emerged. This concept traces back to a memorandum sent to President John F. Kennedy on November 11, 1961, by Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. They emphasized the importance of involving other nations' forces alongside U.S. troops in Vietnam. They argued that the U.S. position would be significantly bolstered if the introduction of forces could be recognized as an action taken under the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, with contributions from other C8O countries. The belief was that international involvement would help alleviate accusations of American imperialism in Southeast Asia and foster the type of consensus that United Nations forces had during the Korean War. However, these early ideas did not materialize at that moment. President Kennedy was more focused on Laos, as the situation in Vietnam did not seem as urgent then. Yet by late 1963, the Laos issue had been tentatively resolved through the 1962 Geneva Accords, while South Vietnam's situation had deteriorated, particularly after the assassination of President Ngo Dinh Diem in a coup in early November. Shortly after that, President Kennedy was assassinated, leaving his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to face the escalating crisis in Vietnam. It wasn't surprising that he also concluded that international support was crucial for strengthening American efforts in Southeast Asia. In the spring of 1964, Johnson sought support from free nations to help defend South Vietnam against communism. He strongly believed that demonstrating solidarity among free world allies in Vietnam would help deflect accusations of American imperialism. During a news conference on April 23, 1964, Johnson publicly expressed this notion, indicating his expectation for increased military aid to Saigon, while also hoping to see forces from other nations joining them to unite in this effort, stop the spread of communism in that region, and the efforts to undermine freedom. Some historians believe the More Flags program originated with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, although there isn't much consensus on that. President Johnson recognized the importance of Rusk's strategy, emphasizing the quest for international backing as a key goal throughout his administration. Just a week after the president's remarks at a press conference, the More Flags program was formalized in a cable sent on May 1st 1964, from Secretary Rusk to America's embassies around the globe. The cable declared, "The United States government has decided to call upon other free world nations to show their support through political and material contributions to the Vietnamese government." Several nations were already extending technical help, development funds, and humanitarian aid, but Rusk urged American ambassadors to ask their host nations for increased support if they were already contributors or firm commitments from those who hadn't yet stepped in. Rusk noted, "The nature and amount of contributions sought are not as significant now as the fact that they are being offered." While not directly stated, the aim was to gather as many flags as possible to showcase international backing for both the South Vietnamese government and for U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. The key was for allied nations to send aid, any form of support to South Vietnam, which would inherently signify their endorsement of the U.S. position. Thus, this initiative to secure aid for South Vietnam in its fight against communism would also enhance the credibility of U.S. involvement and serve as evidence of international approval of America's actions in Vietnam. The primary focus for garnering aid for South Vietnam was directed at the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or CATO. This organization had allowed the United States to ally with South Vietnam and provided a network of potential allies for the conflict. CATO included countries like the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines, Pakistan, and the United States. This diverse group shared little in common, except for their mutual apprehension towards communism. The treaty established a protocol state relationship, which was also given to Laos and Cambodia. These nations received protection through a supplemental agreement to the treaty. The varied composition of CATO, along with each member's individual view of the communist threat, made unified action nearly impossible. CATO's flags were not designed for war. Therefore, invoking the CATO Treaty did not guarantee a unified response from its member nations. Many opted not to engage alongside the U.S. due to their own domestic issues. One study indicated that the reluctance of most CATO countries to answer the U.S. call for increased presence suggests they didn't see the political or military value in committing combat forces to support South Vietnam. In a memorandum from May 25, 1964, McGeorge Bundy, the presidential assistant for national security affairs, suggested convening a high-level conference to seek specific commitments of support from CATO allies. However, this meeting never occurred, marking the last attempt to gain backing under the CATO framework. Ultimately, the treaty was flawed and the organization ineffective, leading to a lack of support from most member states. Although the U.S. would still attempt to secure third-country involvement in Vietnam under the CATO name, it was described by one of President Johnson's advisors as a very shaky vehicle indeed. Rusk's early request for more flags didn't yield significant results. In a circular telegram sent on July 2, 1964, President Johnson expressed his frustration, stating, "I am gravely disappointed by the inadequacy of the actions of our friends and allies in response to our request that they share the burden of free world responsibility in Vietnam. It has been 9 weeks since the Secretary of State asked your embassy to seek assistance from the government where you are stationed. While their verbal responses have shown some sympathy, the actual actions do not reflect that. Recognize your part in this responsibility and understand just how important it is for you to fulfill it." He went on, "I am holding you accountable for ensuring that the government you represent grasps the seriousness with which we regard the threat to freedom in Vietnam and acknowledges that the burden of defending this freedom rests heavily on those nations that enjoy freedom themselves." He concluded by saying, "I look forward to seeing signs of your success very soon." In reply, U.S. ambassadors across Europe, Asia, and Latin America intensified their efforts to persuade nations to contribute to South Vietnam with development funds, medical and engineering advisors, and food. Initially, this effort was not aimed at acquiring foreign combat troops, but that focus would evolve. Typically, American embassies sought aid from host countries based on a list of needed assistance from Headquarters Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Once a country agreed to help, the U.S. government notified the South Vietnamese government, which would then formally request aid from that nation. Despite these diplomatic initiatives, only 15 countries responded to the initial American request, and just 6 offered any meaningful assistance. These nations, including South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and nationalist China, primarily provided non-military aid. Clearly, the More Flags program was falling short of Johnson's expectations. On December 1, 1964, Johnson gathered his closest advisors at the White House. They discussed the best strategies to achieve U.S. objectives in Vietnam, agreeing to make every effort to halt North Vietnam's support for Viet Cong operations in the South, to restore an independent and secure South Vietnam, and to protect other non-communist nations in Southeast Asia. These objectives hinted at a growing U.S. commitment to the conflict, resulting in a corresponding push to rally international support for South Vietnam and U.S. policies in the region. During this meeting, the president emphasized the need for assistance for the Vietnamese government and our allies were acknowledged for their efforts. However, dissatisfaction lingered regarding the More Flags initiative, prompting a call for advisors to create a new plan aimed at boosting international involvement. Following discussions, it was decided against invoking SEATO, opting instead for bilateral support from key allies like Great Britain, Thailand, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand for South Vietnam. Thailand was tasked with providing military aid and ramping up its counterinsurgency efforts domestically. British Prime Minister J. Harold Wilson would be briefed on the situation and asked for his support. William P. Bundy from the State Department would discuss the potential deployment of small combat units with Australia and New Zealand, contingent upon the United States transitioning to a more aggressive military strategy against the communists. The Philippines were also approached for a commitment of about 1,800 troops. The meeting concluded with an agreement to investigate every possible avenue for additional outside assistance. This gathering, along with the agreements made, marked a pivotal moment for the More Flags program. It shifted the focus from merely seeking humanitarian and economic support to pursuing military aid and ultimately combat forces to stand with South Vietnamese and American troops. Understanding the challenge of securing commitments for combat forces from other nations, Johnson recognized the necessity of enticing reluctant countries. On December 15, 1964, the President instructed the State Department to inform America's allies that the United States would cover the full expense of any military aid provided to South Vietnam. As Robert Blackburn noted, if Lyndon Johnson couldn't win over other nations with ideological arguments and diplomatic pressure, he would now seek to incentivize them financially. However, most allies remained unresponsive, with only the Philippines and Korea showing initial support. The nationalist Chinese governments, which had already been providing non-military aid, communicated through diplomatic channels their willingness to consider military assistance for South Vietnam. However, efforts to garner additional support fell short. No previously uncommitted nations stepped forward to help. It's important to recognize that the drive to enlist allies for South Vietnam was primarily an American initiative from the start. While President Johnson was actively seeking outside support to bolster the war effort, the South Vietnamese government showed a distinct lack of enthusiasm about the situation. During a meeting in Washington, the Secretary of State stressed to the visiting Vietnamese foreign minister the urgent need for his government to take more proactive steps to secure assistance from third nations. Chester Cooper, the former director of Asian Affairs for the White House, pointed out that the U.S. effort to enlist more countries began slowly in late 1964 due to the substantial pressure required from Washington to obtain any meaningful commitments. Additionally, he noted the apathy and disinterest of the Saigon government, which was too absorbed in its ongoing internal political strife. Cooper further suggested that Saigon seemed to view the program as a public relations effort aimed at the American audience. Some of the South Vietnamese perspective on this issue can be linked to their cultural and historical context. The Vietnamese people had fought for a millennium against foreign invaders who sought to establish their own national identities among the varied communities of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. As a result, the South Vietnamese were generally hesitant about inviting more foreign troops onto their soil. Thus, from the outset of the More Flags program, requests for aid originated in Washington rather than Saigon, which merely aligned itself with Washington's directives. Consequently, according to Cooper, this positioned Washington as a supplicant in its search for global support. Despite the ambivalence from Saigon, the American initiative to seek free world support gained further urgency as the United States became more directly engaged in the conflict in 1965. It became increasingly vital to frame the war not just as an American endeavor, but as one that involved a broader coalition. In this context, free nations united against the threat of communism. Consequently, the Johnson administration urged its overseas teams to take action for the Many Flags Initiative. To emphasize the importance of this program, Secretary of State Rusk sent a message to all U.S. embassies in January, reaffirming the president's strong commitment, stating the president continues to prioritize gaining the broadest possible support from the free world for South Vietnam. While the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff discussed sending a Marine Expeditionary Brigade to Da Nang, there were renewed discussions on securing combat troops from allied nations. In late February 1965, the Joint Chiefs recommended sending a division from the Republic of Korea to assist with counterinsurgency and base security. They recognized two key considerations for all Allied forces heading to South Vietnam: how the forces would receive logistical support and the command and control dynamics. As the 1st U.S. Marine Battalion made its way to Da Nang, the State Department sought Ambassador Maxwell Taylor's input on the feasibility of creating an international combat force in Vietnam. Taylor had previously voiced concerns about deploying Marines to Da Nang, suggesting that it might lead the Vietnamese government to rely even more on the U.S. to bear the burden. He was also not keen on recruiting foreign troops for the mission in Vietnam. However, as the Johnson administration approached a full-scale troop deployment, the urgency to expand the international presence against the communists grew. During a high-level policy meeting at the White House on April 1, 1965, discussions revolved around increasing U.S. troop levels in Vietnam. It was agreed that exploring the deployment of Allied troops from other countries for combat roles should be done urgently. The decision was made to reach out for combat troops from Australia and New Zealand. There was considerable debate about bringing in troops from the Republic of Korea, who had already expressed a willingness to contribute. However, South Vietnam had shown some hesitance about having Korean forces in their region. Despite challenges, a decision was reached to gain agreement and support from Saigon for possible contributions from other nations, including South Korea. On April 3rd, General William Westmoreland, the top U.S. commander in South Vietnam, provided vital information that further motivated the choice to deploy U.S. forces and seek Allied troops. He reported that parts of the 325th Division of the People's Army of Vietnam were active in South Vietnam, indicating a shift in the conflict as the region faced an invasion from the north. The outcomes of the April 1st meeting were formalized on April 6th with the release of National Security Action Memorandum 328. This document instructed the State Department to discuss with the governments of Korea, Australia, and New Zealand the possibility of sending combat forces to supplement the U.S. troops arriving in South Vietnam. The need for more U.S. troops was reinforced on April 15th when Washington notified Westmoreland about the escalating situation in South Vietnam. As the conflict intensified, President Johnson ramped up his call for Allied support. He utilized every strategy at his disposal: the Seattle Treaty, diplomatic pressure, personal appeals, and the allocation of U.S. foreign aid to expand Allied participation in South Vietnam. What began as a request for various forms of assistance evolved into a demand for combat troops, not solely economic or technical help. With nearly 2 decades of containment policy against communism at stake in South Vietnam and growing criticism of U.S. actions in Southeast Asia, the president was understandably keen to avoid facing this challenge alone. At a conference in Honolulu on April 20, 1965, the deployment of 1 Australian battalion at Vung Tau and 1 Korean regimental combat team of 3 battalions at Quang Ngai was approved. These forces had been previously offered by both nations during separate talks. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor was tasked with gaining the approval of the South Vietnamese government. It was later determined that the Republic of Korea would be asked to send a full division instead of just a regimental combat team. In early May, General Westmoreland outlined the necessary procedures. Command relationships were established to govern how Allied forces would be utilized when they arrived in Vietnam. The commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command would take operational control of what became known as the Free World Military Forces. While these forces would keep their national command identities, they would operate under the oversight of senior U.S. commanders, who would also provide administrative and logistical support. As Westmoreland and his team developed the procedures for integrating the Allied troops into the command structure, Australia and Korea prepared to send the promised troops. Australia was the first to respond, creating a task force centered around the Royal Australian Regiment. This task force arrived in June 1965 and came under the operational control of the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, stationed in Bien Hoa and III Corps. By the end of 1965, additional elements, including a 105mm battery, a field engineer troop, 2 signal troops, and an air reconnaissance flight, brought the Australian commitment to 1,557 personnel. In May 1965, New Zealand's government decided to replace its earlier engineer detachment with a combat force. By July, a 105mm howitzer battery had arrived in South Vietnam and was assigned to the 173rd to provide fire support for the Australian task force. By year's end, there were 119 Kiwi soldiers in South Vietnam. Ultimately, General Westmoreland aimed for Australia and New Zealand to deploy a full Australian-New Zealand Army Corps brigade within the next year. Initially, the Republic of Korea deployed a task force that included an Army Engineer Battalion alongside support and self-defense troops, focusing their early efforts on civic action projects. The main body of this force arrived in March 1965 and was based at Di An in Bien Hoa Province. Following the decisions made at the Honolulu Conference in April, the U.S. requested additional South Korean forces. In August, Seoul agreed to send an Army Infantry Division, a Marine Corps regiment, and field support troops. Consequently, by early November 1965, the ROK Capital Infantry Division and the 2nd Marine Brigade were fully deployed, totaling 20,620 soldiers. These forces were placed under the de facto operational control of the U.S. Commanding General Field Forces Vietnam and given security responsibilities. At Cam Ranh Bay and Quy Nhon, by the end of 1965, President Johnson was increasingly frustrated with the lack of support from allies, despite the arrival of the Anzacs and the Koreans. While some nations had made commitments, the overall response fell far short of Johnson's expectations and failed to create the international consensus he was aiming for. As the conflict intensified, his requests for assistance were often met with indifference, and in some cases, outright hostility. The growing unpopularity of the war abroad made it challenging for U.S. embassy personnel to persuade America's allies to engage in the situation in South Vietnam. Many countries hesitated, fearing backlash from their own public and the international community. Some nations, both current and former allies, spoke out against Johnson's decisions to escalate the war and his calls for help. The French, led by Charles de Gaulle, were particularly critical of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. They not only refused to lend support, but also emphatically condemned the war, aligning with critics who labeled the U.S. as a neo-colonial aggressor in the region. With no hope of influencing de Gaulle, Johnson shifted his attention to Great Britain. Initially, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson had backed the U.S. stance in Vietnam, but as the conflict dragged on, support waned. Still, Johnson, eager to avoid any perception of a colonial initiative, urged Wilson to commit British troops to Vietnam. He even jokingly suggested he would settle for a company of bagpipers and called for a contingent of 300 to 400 British personnel, along with 1 or 2 aircraft squadrons. However, Wilson, while still in favor of U.S. small goals in Vietnam, had to navigate growing anti-war sentiments at home and deemed it unwise for Britain to get entangled in the conflict. Like many of America's European partners, he was concerned that the U.S. was becoming overly fixated on Vietnam, neglecting its responsibilities in Europe. The British Prime Minister soon found his own political challenges on the rise. Position was jeopardized due to his support of Johnson, resulting in the loss of any hope for assistance in Vietnam from Great Britain. Johnson had previously sought support from West Germany, which responded with a $40 million aid package for South Vietnam, affirming its full backing for U.S. policy in Vietnam. This aid and accompanying statements were positively received in Washington, but the reality was far more nuanced. Although Germany backed the U.S. efforts to contain communism in Southeast Asia, many within the Bonn government shared concerns, like the British, regarding the possibility of the U.S. becoming too weakened by the Vietnam War to fulfill its defense commitments in Europe. The issue of sending troops beyond Germany remained sensitive and was prohibited by the federal constitution. Having received limited real support from European allies, Johnson turned to rallying more flags from America's friends in Asia and the Pacific. Thailand had been closely watching the situation in Vietnam, aware that the conflict could spill into their own nation via Cambodia. They initially deployed troops to South Vietnam in 1964, sending a 16-man Royal Thai Air Force contingent. However, this level of Thai support did not satisfy Johnson, who wrote to Prime Minister Thanom Kittikachorn asking for an increased commitment to combat support in South Vietnam. It was crucial for Johnson to showcase greater Asian involvement in his Many Flags initiative to demonstrate to the American public that the effort was genuine rather than a mere political facade. Furthermore, bolstering troop contributions from Thailand and other countries would help alleviate Westmoreland's escalating demands for more U.S. forces to continue the fight. In December 1965, the Thai government announced plans to send an 800-man combat battalion to South Vietnam, with over 5,000 Thais volunteering to join the force. Nevertheless, the Thai government communicated to Washington that the condition for deploying this battalion was that the U.S. would provide funding, equipment, and supplies. The U.S. concurred, and on February 17, 1966, the Royal Thai Military Assistance Group Vietnam was established in South Vietnam, incorporating the Thai Air Force contingent as part of that group. Over the years, Thailand's commitment in Vietnam grew. The ongoing requests from the U.S. government would escalate to over 11,000 troops. It would cost around $50 million each year for the United States to train, equip, and supply Thai units in Vietnam. The U.S. also sought troops from the Philippines, and the response, along with the associated costs, mirrored what was seen with the Thai forces. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos agreed to send a 1,500-man engineer unit to South Vietnam, motivated as much by the need for financial assistance for his nation as by concern for the Vietnamese people. In exchange for deploying the Philippine troops, the U.S. military assistance program covered their expenses and provided Marcos with various forms of military aid, much of which was intended for use in the Philippines rather than Vietnam itself. By mid-October 1966, the 1st Philippine Civic Action Group Vietnam, consisting of 2,000 personnel, had set up a base camp on the outskirts of Tay Ninh City. This unit included an engineer construction battalion, medical and rural community development teams, a security battalion, a field artillery battery, along with logistics and headquarters elements. The Philippine deployment would cost the United States $39 million from 1967 to 1969. As efforts to recruit more nations fell flat, the Johnson administration turned its attention to encouraging existing allies in Vietnam to expand their involvement. Responding to Washington's requests, Australia's commitment expanded from 1 battalion to 2, adding several headquarters, support, and aviation units. With additional troop deployments and the arrival of RAF C-130 Hercules air transports, the Australian force reached its peak in October 1967, exceeding 8,000 troops in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, in response to American appeals, New Zealand's commitment grew to about 1,000 combat and artillery support troops. Unlike Thailand and the Philippines, both Australia and New Zealand covered their own costs for maintaining their forces in South Vietnam. These nations were deeply concerned that a communist victory in Vietnam could influence the rest of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Prime Minister Keith Holyoake of New Zealand remarked, South Vietnam is somewhat of a test case in Asia. If the communists succeed there, they will likely move on to test their influence further in Thailand, Malaysia, and beyond. Every move the communists made brought them closer to Australia and New Zealand. The leadership in Australia shared Holyoake's view, and even with increasing frustration over the war at home, both Australia and New Zealand kept a strong military presence in South Vietnam right until the American involvement came to a close. The Johnson administration also persuaded South Korea to boost its commitment, ultimately increasing the number of Korean troops to nearly 50,000. This was significant because Korea had previously defended itself against communist aggression with international support. South Korean President Chung Hee-park emphasized that their country's role in Vietnam would enhance their national security and fortify the anti-communist stance of the free world. Yet Park's statement didn't capture the full story. South Korea's motivations weren't purely selfless. The U.S. covered the financial burden of their engagement in the war, totaling $1 billion from 1965 to 1970. Additionally, the U.S. provided South Korea with $150 million in development loans and $600 million through military procurement and construction contracts. While Johnson made consistent attempts to seek broader international involvement in the war, his decision to bomb North Vietnam in June 1966 effectively dashed hopes of expanding the coalition. The peak of troop buildup came during the fiscal year 1966, followed by a period of stabilization and a gradual decline in free world military forces as the conflict continued. Once Richard Nixon took office and initiated the pullout of U.S. troops, the members of the free world military forces also began their withdrawal from South Vietnam. Throughout the war, thousands of Australians, New Zealanders, Koreans, Thais, and Filipinos fought alongside American and South Vietnamese troops. The total casualties for the Free World military forces in Vietnam stood at 5,241, with 4,407 from Korea and 475 from Australia and New Zealand. There's no doubt that these forces played a role in the overall Allied effort, yet Lyndon Johnson's vision of a united international support for U.S. presence and goals in South Vietnam never came to fruition, despite immense efforts to achieve it. The international reaction to the ongoing U.S. presence in South Vietnam, combined with the increasing unpopularity of the war globally and Saigon's uncertainty, undermined Johnson's ambitions. In the end, the conflict remained firmly America's war. Operation Junction City was a vast 2.5-month campaign aimed at War Zone C, intended to clear the area and permanently dismantle a significant enemy stronghold. The goal was to locate the enemy, hold them in position, and eliminate them to allow for effective pacification efforts. Junction City showcased how to generate force and utilize shaping operations to sway the battlefield. Yet, it also highlighted the challenges of conducting counterinsurgency against a foe that included both guerrilla fighters and main force units, who had easy access to cross-border havens. Ultimately, the operation yielded noticeable results with enemy casualties and seized or destroyed equipment and supplies. General Bernard W. Rogers, the Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, labeled Junction City as a turning point in the war. However, despite its tactical achievements, it resembled a step in what General Dave Palmer deemed an escalating military stalemate. In the end, locating, fixing, and eliminating the enemy proved to be a tough task. Launched on February 22, 1967, the operation aimed to uncover the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, headquarters, and weaken the 9th Viet Cong Division. Controlled by 2 field forces, Vietnam, around 35,000 troops were fielded throughout the operation. At its inception, it was the largest military endeavor of the war up to that point. U.S. ground combat forces first entered Vietnam in March 1965 with the landing of the 9th Marines at Da Nang. They were soon joined by the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 1st Infantry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 1st Cavalry Division. By the close of 1965, over 184,000 U.S. ground troops were stationed in Vietnam. The year 1966 ushered in a phase of rapid troop deployment and marked the beginning of substantial offensive operations by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. By 1967, U.S. combat operations were focused on locating and destroying Viet Cong and PAVN forces in the field, engaging in a war of attrition. Westmoreland, the commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, faced significant policy limitations that restricted his ability to attack enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam. He was confined to conducting a strategic defense within friendly territories. To achieve victory, Westmoreland believed that he needed to make the conflict so costly that Hanoi would pull back its troops and abandon its efforts to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. As a result, while the Army of the Republic of Vietnam focused on protecting and stabilizing population centers, U.S. and Allied forces aimed to engage communist factions in the less populated regions near the western borders with Cambodia and Laos, as well as in other insurgent strongholds throughout the South. These operations typically manifested as search and destroy missions carried out away from densely populated areas and in locations where the enemy was firmly entrenched. They involved aggressive assaults from infantry and armored units, leveraged Allied air mobility, and employed heavy supporting fire to locate, fix, and eliminate the enemy and their stronghold areas. As the number of Army combat forces in Vietnam increased, General Westmoreland established two corps-level commands under MAP-V. The I Field Force, Vietnam was tasked with overseeing the 2-Corps Tactical Zone, which included the Central Highlands, while the Toot Field Force, Vietnam managed the 3-Corps Tactical Zone, bordered by the Central Highlands to the north and the Mekong Delta to the south. Reporting directly to the MAP-V commander, these field force leaders were the top Army tactical commanders in their designated regions. In March 1966, Lieutenant Gen. Jonathan O. Seaman took command of the Toot Field Force Vietnam. A graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1934, he saw service during World War II in both Europe and the Pacific. Headquartered in Long Binh, Toot Field Force Vietnam was activated on March 15, 1966, becoming not only the largest corps-level command in Vietnam, but also one of the largest in Army history. As the commander of Toot Field Force, Lieutenant General Seaman oversaw U.S. forces in the 3-Corps Tactical Zone, which encompassed 11 provinces surrounding Saigon. The major VC base areas lay to the northeast and northwest of Saigon, encompassing war zones C and D, the Iron Triangle, and the Boi Loi Woods. Additionally, he was tasked with guarding the primary enemy routes coming from Cambodia that posed a direct threat to Saigon, the capital of the Republic of Vietnam. Lieutenant General Seaman knew this region well, having previously led the 1st Infantry Division, which had been active in the 3-Corps Tactical Zone since arriving in Vietnam back in July 1965. At this stage of the conflict, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were facing a mixed threat. They had to tackle an externally supported insurgency while also dealing with the main force VC and North Vietnamese units in a more traditional manner. According to MAP-V priorities, Lieutenant General Seaman concentrated on the latter, delegating the task of managing the insurgency and pacification efforts in his operational area to the ARVN and local militia forces, who were better suited for fostering Saigon's influence among their own communities. Seaman's primary concern was the danger presented by the main force VC and North Vietnamese units operating from their sanctuaries in Cambodia and the previously mentioned base areas, which posed a significant risk to Saigon. He had ample forces at his disposal, but the scale of his responsibilities was considerable. Instead of adopting a defensive posture and waiting for the enemy to approach, he aimed to take the fight to them, even where they were most formidable. However, as he had learned during his command of the Big Red One, it was challenging to engage the enemy on anything other than their terms. With the prohibitions against entering Cambodia, the key to defeating the main enemy forces lay in isolating them within their bases in Vietnam and preventing their retreat into Cambodia once combat began. The vast area of operations and its close proximity to the border complicated this endeavor. In May 1966, taking these challenges into account, Lieutenant General Seaman instructed his staff to devise a plan to clear War Zone C and eradicate it as an enemy stronghold. The operation would ideally set the stage for subsequent pacification efforts aimed at diminishing any lingering influence of the Viet Cong in that region. This operation, named Junction City, was slated to begin in January 1967. While planning for the operation, Lieutenant General Seaman also instructed his staff to prepare for a similar strike into the Iron Triangle, another crucial enemy stronghold that posed a serious threat to Saigon. This operation would be named Cedar Falls. For both missions, Seaman aimed to locate, engage, and destroy enemy forces in the area before they could retreat to safe havens in Cambodia. As the planning progressed, intelligence reports revealed a significant military buildup in the Iron Triangle area. Concerned about the escalating threat, as it was even closer to Saigon than the target area for Junction City, Seaman feared an impending attack on the capital. He proposed to General Westmoreland that the Junction City operation be delayed in favor of Cedar Falls. This shift would help mitigate the immediate threat to Saigon and also free up an additional division for Junction City, since the 9th Infantry Division was en route and would be assigned to EUFV upon its arrival. Westmoreland concurred with Seaman's recommendation. Cedar Falls would proceed first, followed by an attack into War Zone C immediately afterward. The Iron Triangle covered about 300 square kilometers and was located roughly 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon, including the Thanh Dien Forestry Reserve. It had served as a major staging area for the Viet Cong since the war's inception. Seaman outlined the mission of Cedar Falls as the destruction of enemy forces, installations, and infrastructure within the area. The operation aimed specifically at the VC Military Region 4 headquarters and the 272nd VC Regiment. His goal was to dismantle the Iron Triangle's capabilities as a sanctuary and operational base for the enemy. This plan not only involved direct assaults against the VC, but also required the relocation of local civilians and the demolition of their homes to cut off support for the VC. Once civilians were evacuated, the area would be designated a specified strike zone, meaning anyone found there afterward would be classified as an enemy combatant. Operation Cedar Falls commenced on January 8, 1967, with 2 Army divisions, 1 light infantry and 1 paratroop brigade, and 1. The operation involved an armored cavalry regiment along with several South Vietnamese Army battalions, totaling 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. The strategy was a hammer and anvil tactic, where part of the Allied forces acted as the anvil, blocking the enemy's movement, while the rest were positioned throughout the area to force the enemy into these defensive locations. Additionally, U.S. troops encircled the area to cut off any escape routes for the enemy. However, during the operation, the enemy proved to be quite elusive, retreating into Cambodia or hiding within a network of tunnels in the region. Although the operation concluded on January 26, 1967, without any large-scale confrontations, Allied troops participated in several smaller skirmishes and discovered numerous enemy supply caches. Meanwhile, engineers worked on clearing the jungle, and chemicals were applied to defoliate specific areas to prevent the enemy from establishing a sanctuary so near Saigon. The operation also involved relocating the 5,987 residents of the village of Ben Suk, which had historically supported the Viet Cong, leading to the village's destruction. Cedar Falls resulted in 750 confirmed enemy deaths and 213 captures, alongside the capture or destruction of a significant amount of weapons, ammunition, rations, and other supplies. The friendly losses included 72 U.S. soldiers killed and 337 wounded. From Seaman's and Westmoreland's viewpoint, Cedar Falls was deemed a significant success. Seaman noted that the operation showcased the effectiveness of extensive operations in Viet Cong-controlled areas, suggesting that the enemy would now need to reassess their capabilities in comparison to those of the Allies. However, claims that the Iron Triangle is no more were greatly exaggerated. In truth, as soon as U.S. and South Vietnamese troops departed, the Viet Cong swiftly returned to their strongholds. Cedar Falls also turned into a public relations challenge, due to the critical coverage surrounding the forced evacuation of Ben Suk's residents and the destruction of the village. Despite this, Generals Westmoreland and Seaman viewed Cedar Falls as progress and sought to maintain momentum by initiating Operation Junction City. The planned operation focused on War Zone C, a vast area measuring 50 by 30 miles. A marshy region lies along the Cambodian border, roughly 45 miles northwest of Saigon. This expansive area, covering 1,000 square miles, is bordered to the north and west by Cambodia, while its eastern edge runs parallel to Highway 13. It spans parts of Tay Ninh, Bin Long, and Bin Duong provinces. This location is crucial for both the MASIV and IOFV, as it sits between Saigon and the Cambodian border, serving as a common launch point for enemy forces and supplies flowing into Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Warzone C is particularly significant because it's the operational domain of the 9th VC Division, one of the enemy's most formidable units. Additionally, it's believed that the Central Office for South Vietnam, or COSVN, the main headquarters directing all enemy activities in the southern region, is located here. The goal of Junction City was to penetrate deep into Warzone C to locate and dismantle COSVN, while also targeting the 9th VC Division and the 101st NVA Regiment, another unit reportedly present in the region. The mission aimed to wipe out all enemy base camps and installations within the operation zone. Ultimately, Lieutenant General Seaman aimed not only to weaken enemy forces but also to provide a shield for revolutionary development in the area, as part of future pacification efforts. As part of this operation, IIFV planned to set up a Special Forces Civilian Irregular Defense Group camp and an airfield at Prek Klok. The original plan involved securing the target area with friendly forces while additional Allied troops would engage and eliminate the enemy forces, supply depots, and base camps trapped within. Planning for Junction City was intricate due to the scale of the operational area and the various units involved. One of the primary challenges for Lieutenant General Seaman and his team was to maximize combat power swiftly. If they couldn't muster enough forces quickly enough across the operational area, the enemy might dodge combat and retreat to safe havens in Cambodia before they could be confronted, much like what occurred during Cedar Falls. To execute this operation, IIFV committed 35,000 Allied troops, including elements from the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions and the 173rd Airborne. The 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, a brigade from the 4th Infantry Division, along with several ARVN units, were involved in the operation. However, due to commitments to missions in other areas, some organic units couldn't participate. Therefore, the initial task organization for the operation included 1st Infantry Division, 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, 173rd Airborne Brigade, T.F. Wallace, ARVN, 25th Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, 196th Light Infantry Brigade, 11th ACR, TF Alpha ARVN. For this operation, IUFV had access to 22 maneuver battalions, 14 artillery battalions, and 3 ARVN battalions. This task organization allowed for combined arms operations at both the battalion and squadron levels. Given the size and scope of the operation, EFFV had to manage a significant troop and logistical buildup, being careful to avoid revealing plans too soon. Therefore, planning took place under tight security. As combat forces readied themselves, Lieutenant General Seaman initiated 2 deception operations aimed at concealing troop movements and supplies to areas surrounding Warzone C. Operation Gadsden, run by the 25th Infantry Division, took place along the Cambodian border in the far western part of the zone, while Operation 2SN was executed by the 1st Infantry Division east of the Michelin rubber plantation. Lieutenant General Seaman hoped these operations would not only place blocking forces on the western and eastern sides, but also lure the 9th VC Division to shift its 271st and 272nd Regiments into the target area for the upcoming operation. Planners for Junction City created a 2-phased operation that echoed the hammer and anvil strategy used in Operation Cedar Falls, but on a larger scale. The plan involved 5 U.S. brigades forming a massive, inverted horseshoe-shaped cordon in the western half of Warzone C. Once this cordon was established, other forces would advance northward to push the enemy into the blocking positions. The operation involved the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division and the 196th Light Infantry Brigade setting up blocking positions to the west of the target area, near the Cambodian border, about 4 to 5 miles east of Highways 22 and 246. The 1st Infantry Division took up its position to the north along Highway 4. Meanwhile, the 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 1st Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division were tasked with sealing off the eastern part of the area. Once these blocking forces were established, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment on the right and the 2nd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division on the left would move southward into the expansive, inverted horseshoe. The strategy aimed to funnel enemy forces into the U.S., blocking positions where they could be effectively eliminated. With nearly 250 helicopters needed for transporting the 8 infantry battalions under the 1st Infantry Division, the 3 battalions from the 173rd Airborne Brigade were set to make a combat parachute jump into their designated blocking positions. Lieutenant General Seaman anticipated positioning as many troops on the ground as quickly as possible before COSVN and the 9th VC Division had the chance to retreat. The operation demanded precise timing and controlled movements to create the necessary combat strength and effectively secure the perimeter. Fire support was to come from 17 artillery battalions and over 4,000 close air support missions, with airspace management over the objective area being a significant concern. Junction City commenced at 0700 on February 22nd, with the parachute drop executed by the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Around 840 paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Infantry boarded 16 C-130s in Bien Hoa and parachuted into designated drop zones in northern Tây Ninh Province, just 7 miles from Cambodia. This unopposed parachute drop marked the sole major U.S. combat jump of the war. At the same time, 249 helicopters, participating in the largest single-day air mobility operation in Army aviation history, deployed 8 infantry battalions into the northern blocking positions. Lieutenant General Seaman aimed to catch the enemy off guard with this simultaneous troop insertion. However, the degree of surprise was difficult to measure, as initial contact was minimal. The following day, Southern forces along Highway 247 began their advance northward into the Horseshoe. The 2nd Brigade of the 25th Division and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, engaged in combat with only light resistance. Despite facing opposition, some tanks and armored personnel carriers were damaged by mines and rocket-propelled grenade fire. Both units started to uncover large amounts of enemy supplies and equipment, alongside numerous fortifications and base camp sites. Meanwhile, units patrolling the perimeter of the Horseshoe discovered enemy base areas while securing their blocking positions. Encounters with the enemy were limited, with reports indicating forces were present in small squad sizes. On February 24, 1967, Lieutenant General Seaman instructed the commanding generals of the 1st and 25th Divisions to conduct a comprehensive search of Western War Zone C. The 2nd Brigade of the 25th Division and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment were ordered to advance northward into the blocking zones. The forces continued to find enemy base camps and supplies, capturing and destroying considerable quantities of weapons, ammunition, rice, and various other supplies. On February 28th, units from the 173rd Airborne Brigade located the Viet Cong's Central Information Office, which housed an underground photographic lab complete with film. Shortly after, a company from the brigade encountered an enemy company east of Kadam, leading to an intense engagement that resulted in significant casualties on both sides. 20 U.S. paratroopers were killed and 28 wounded, while the Viet Cong lost 39. On that same day, a company from the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry came into contact with a well-entrenched and concealed enemy force near the Prek Klok River. After unleashing heavy fire on the lead platoon, the Viet Cong launched a ground assault, overrunning the American unit, inflicting casualties on almost every soldier. They then focused on the rest of the company, triggering a fierce firefight. Close air support was called in as reinforcements were deployed to assist the beleaguered company. After several airstrikes, 2 companies were inserted by helicopter, compelling the enemy to retreat. When the reinforcements linked up with the company, which had already suffered nearly 50% casualties, they began to move to a landing zone for the night. The following morning, An inspection of the battlefield revealed 144 enemy dead and 40 weapons. U.S. casualties from this confrontation were also significant, totaling 25 killed in action and 28 wounded. Subsequent intelligence analysis suggested that the initial company encountered was significantly outmatched. They likely stumbled upon an enemy staging area, preparing for an assault on convoy operations along Route 4. In the following 10 days, there were numerous daily engagements in the Junction City operational zone, though most were at the platoon level or smaller. Lieutenant General Seaman aimed to locate and confront larger enemy units, but for the most part, the enemy battalions managed to evade contact. Throughout this operation, Allied forces uncovered numerous significant base camps and seized vast amounts of enemy equipment and supplies. At this juncture, Lieutenant General Seaman opted to relinquish his northern positions across from the Cambodian border, seeking to broaden the search for the main enemy forces, which had proven quite elusive. On March 1st, he instructed the 1st Infantry Division to engage what was identified as the 101st Regiment and potentially COSVN's Intelligence Bureau, believed to be located southeast of Khatum and east of Route 4. Simultaneously, he directed the 25th Infantry Division to deploy at least half of its troops into an area known as the Elephant's Ear, west of Highway 22, where intelligence suggested the 271st VC Regiment was based. On March 10th, the 272nd VC Regiment launched an attack on the 168th Engineer Battalion, which was constructing a Special Forces base camp near Prek Klok. The engineers were supported by the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion, 33rd Artillery. The enemy's choice to concentrate significant forces against an American position might have been influenced by the entrapment of a segment of the COSVN during the pincer movement along the Cambodian border. A prisoner later revealed that the assault served as a diversion to draw Allied forces away from COSVN's military staff section. The attack commenced at 10:08 p.m., featuring a heavy barrage from 60, 82, and 120 mm mortars. Once the indirect fire ceased, 2 VC battalions surged at the infantry from the east and southwest. Concurrently, the VC initiated a secondary offensive against Artillery Base 1. With robust close air support, the infantry successfully defended their perimeter against the primary VC assault, while the artillery, firing their howitzers directly into the approaching enemy, ultimately repelled the attackers. The following morning revealed 197 enemy KIA on the battlefield. By March 18th, Junction City transitioned into Phase 2, which shifted its focus to clearing the eastern part of War Zone C. In this stage, Lieutenant General Seaman and 2F FV assumed control of the 1st Brigade, 9th Infantry Division, and the 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division. Although the 173rd Airborne Brigade was not originally included in Phase 2, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division advocated for its inclusion, leading to the Airborne Brigade being attached to the Big Red One. Concurrently, the 3rd Brigade from the 1st Division handed over security duties for Prek Lok SF Camp and the surrounding area to the 196th Light Infantry Brigade before departing for another mission focused on revolutionary development elsewhere. In Phase 1, U.S. forces thoroughly searched the area inside the Horseshoe, resulting in reports of 835 VC NVA killed, 15 captured, and the seizure of 264 individual and crew-served weapons, along with vast amounts of supplies and equipment. Seaman felt disheartened that the outcomes of Phase 1 were less than expected and that COSVN remained elusive. With the western section of War Zone C secured during Phase 1, the strategy for Phase 2 was to conduct search and destroy operations in the eastern region. Lieutenant General Seaman intended to oversee the operation while allowing the leaders of the 1st and 25th Divisions to operate autonomously within their designated areas. He believed this would provide the necessary flexibility for the commanders to respond to emerging situations. This tactic led to several fierce confrontations. On the night of March 19th, a troop from the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry of the 9th Infantry Division, came under attack at their defensive position at Bao Bang, assaulted by the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 273rd VC Regiment. Amidst the fierce combat, the cavalrymen took cover inside their armored personnel carriers, while artillery within the perimeter fired anti-personnel beehive rounds at the encroaching forces. While holding their ground, troops B and C from the 5th Cavalry fought through to provide support to their surrounded teammates. Throughout the night, the U.S. Air Force conducted 87 close air support missions under illumination to help repel the attackers. In the end, the combined firepower of the armored cavalry, supporting artillery, and air support proved decisive. Air support caused the enemy to pull back. The battle ended with 227 enemy soldiers killed. On the U.S. side, there were 3 fatalities and 63 wounded. Early in the morning of March 21st, at Fire Support Base Gold near Suoi Tre, the 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery, and the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry from the 3rd Brigade, 4th Division, faced a heavy assault from 2 communist regiments, the 273rd from the 9th VC Division and the Pavan 16th Regiment. Under the cover of a relentless mortar barrage, about 2,500 enemy troops attacked, breaking through FSB Gold's defenses. These human wave attacks were supported by a massive amount of RPG rockets, recoilless rifle rounds, and automatic gunfire. The close quarters combat was fierce, but the defenders held firm, aided by effective close air support against the VC. At one point, the artillerymen fired beehive rounds directly at the attackers, yet they continued to advance. As the battle progressed, the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry fought its way into FSB Gold to reinforce the defenders. The fighting continued into daylight, and FSB Gold was finally relieved by elements of the 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor. This 70-vehicle tank and mechanized infantry column completely shattered the enemy's organized resistance, forcing the remaining attackers to retreat into the jungle. General Hong Kam, commander of the 9th VC Division, later admitted that his forces had taken severe losses during the Suoi Tre battle. Tragically, the defenders also paid a heavy price. 31 Americans lost their lives and 187 were wounded. On March 24th, Lieutenant General Seaman was succeeded by Lieutenant Gen. Bruce Palmer, Jr. as the commanding general of Suit Field Force, Vietnam. Palmer, acting on his staff's recommendations, determined that the search in southeastern War Zone C had reached its limit and was about to order a halt to operations in that area when new intelligence indicated that the 271st Regiment was moving toward Kadam. As a result, Palmer ordered the 196th Light Infantry Brigade north to intercept them. However, the VC Regiment moved so quickly that by the time the 196th arrived in Kadam, the enemy had already passed through to the east. The 271st Regiment would later be involved in the last major. The Battle of Junction City occurred near Ap Gu at Landing Zone George, which is situated 23 miles north of Dao Tieng and just 3 miles from the Cambodian border. On March 26th, the 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander M. Haig, occupied LZ George. 5 days later, as Company B was advancing eastward from the LZ, they came under intense attack and found themselves pinned down. Haig deployed A Company to assist B Company, and both units managed to retreat to the defensive area near the LZ, which had been bolstered by troops from the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry. In the early hours of April 1st, the 271st VC Regiment and the 1st VC Battalion of the 70th Guards launched a significant assault. On the northeast side of the perimeter, defended by C Company, the enemy broke through. However, American forces pushed back, and a combination of artillery, helicopter gunships, and close air support ultimately repelled the attackers. During this confrontation, the U.S. lost 17 soldiers, while around 600 enemy combatants were killed. Although Operation Junction City was initially designed to consist of only 2 phases, General Palmer chose to extend it to a Phase 3, starting on April 15th, aiming to capitalize on the successes at Suoi Tre and Ap Gu. A brigade task force made up of 1 mechanized battalion from the 25th Infantry Division and an ARVN battalion conducted continuous sweeps through War Zone C in search of enemy forces. Simultaneously, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade was reassigned from the operational control of UFV and sent north to the I-Corps Tactical Zone. Units from the 9th Infantry Division temporarily moved into the area left by the 196th. However, these Phase 3 sweeps yielded minimal results. With very little enemy contact, the main focus shifted to improving and clearing roads, constructing bridges, and establishing the Pret Special Forces Camp. On May 4, 1967, General Palmer ended Operation Junction City. On a tactical level, it was deemed a success. Communist propaganda claimed that the operation resulted in over 14,000 U.S. and ARVN troops killed, alongside the destruction of 800 armored vehicles and the capture of 119 artillery pieces. In reality, the figures were much lower, with 218 killed and 1,576 wounded. Additionally, losses included 3 tanks, 4 helicopters, 5 howitzers, and 21 armored personnel carriers. IIFV reported that they killed 728 enemy soldiers, though they couldn't determine how many were wounded. They also captured 490 weapons, seized 850 tons of food supplies, uncovered 500,000 pages of documents, and destroyed more than 5,000 bunkers and military structures. When Junction City concluded on May 14, 1967, it marked a record as the most successful operation thus far concerning confirmed enemy losses. MCV and UFV asserted that most of the operation's major goals were met, except for locating and destroying COSVN. Even though they couldn't eliminate the senior enemy headquarters, many felt a turning point had been reached. Yet, looking back, Junction City did not provide any long-term strategic advantage. The enemy managed to escape into their sanctuaries in Cambodia. The various attacks around the horseshoe achieved tactical surprise, but by the end of D-Day, the enemy recognized the cordon's shape and purpose and quickly dispersed. As one account noted, it was physically impossible to prevent the enemy from slipping away whenever he wanted. The jungle was simply too dense and too vast. There were intense battles on the edges of the horseshoe, where Allied forces inflicted significant losses on the enemy at Sui Tre and Ap Gu. Despite causing damage to some VC units, the bulk of the enemy, including the elusive COSVN headquarters, managed to escape to fight another day. General John Hay, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, pointed out several factors leading to this situation: the closeness of a privileged sanctuary, the challenge of establishing a seal with enough troop density to block infiltration routes, and the difficulty in achieving total surprise due to extensive troop repositioning and logistical support before D-Day. While Junction City was underway, Warzone C had effectively been denied to the Communists as a staging ground. Yet, 2 Field Force could not stop enemy forces from escaping the trap that the planners had hoped for. Brigadier General Rogers, the Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, highlighted a more enduring shortfall of the operation. One of the discouraging aspects of both Cedar Falls and Junction City, Rogers noted that the critical issue was our lack of sufficient forces, both American and South Vietnamese, to maintain operations in the Iron Triangle and Warzone C, ultimately allowing the Viet Cong to return. Historian Gregory Daddis highlights that Junction City was intended to establish a protective barrier for revolutionary development, yet there were no plans for American units to remain to fulfill that purpose. As a result, Warzone C was far from being neutralized. While 3 enemy regiments were significantly weakened during the conflict, those losses were only temporary, and they regrouped in less than a year. Still, Junction City demonstrated that the main Viet Cong supply and operations centers in South Vietnam were vulnerable to stronger U.S. firepower and mobility. Consequently, the Communists relocated their headquarters into Cambodia. With the White House hesitant to approve large-scale operations across the border, American strategists had little option but to pursue a defensive approach aimed at wearing down the Viet Cong and PAVN through attrition. Although major operations like Cedar Falls and Junction City yielded some notable results by keeping enemy main force units at bay in their remote camps, these efforts left the more populated regions for the ARVN to manage. Westmoreland couldn't afford to keep significant forces away from their bases for extended periods without risking local security. Once U.S. troops retreated from the distant areas, the enemy quickly reoccupied their camps and resumed operations. IIFV, similar to its counterpart in the Central Highlands, lacked enough troops to safeguard both its bases and the surrounding communities, while also generating sufficient combat power to drive the enemy out. This meant it was unable to maintain a permanent presence in these areas to deny them to the enemy. Just 10 days following Junction City, Warzone C was reportedly teeming with what seemed to be Viet Cong. The 3 regiments of the 9th VC Division were deemed combat ineffective at the end of the operation, yet the enemy consistently proved capable of replenishing their losses. Operation Junction City illustrates the challenges faced in addressing such conflicts. In counterinsurgency operations, we face a complex combat situation that involves both insurgents and conventional enemy forces. The essence of these operations is to clear, hold, and build, yet often we only possess enough military strength to clear specific areas without the means to maintain control. This challenge intensifies when there are secure sanctuaries across international borders that our forces cannot enter to pursue the enemy. Consequently, regions like the Iron Triangle and Warzone C remained entrenched enemy bastions, constantly contested from the Cedar Falls and Junction City operations until the fighting ceased in 1975. While operations like Junction City were notable in their scale and ambition, they did not yield lasting strategic advantages. As Brig Gen John S. Brown noted, as long as the Communists had the means and will to continue such an uneven contest. Ultimately, this led to a bloody stalemate, with rising casualties on both sides. If this story has enlightened you about a lesser-known aspect of the Vietnam War, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss what's next. And if you want to follow this story into the largest U.S. airborne operation of the war and the intense challenges of Operation Junction City, click on the next video now and keep the journey going.